Hi everyone, I'm back again with my book videos, and this time I'm talking about James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. It's a surprise to nobody that I absolutely loved this book. I know that I say that about a lot of the books that I read, but that's also probably because I'm like, this year especially, I've been reading a lot of classics and I've been reading a lot of books from like prize winner lists, so it tracks. But I knew I would love this book because everything I've seen of James Baldwin, like all of his essays and like quotes and videos and stuff like that, I've always really enjoyed, but I somehow just never got around to reading him. And I actually bought Giovanni's Room on impulse. Like, I hadn't even really read the blurb or knew what it was about. Of course, I kind of knew it was about like a homosexual relationship. I knew it was based in Paris somewhat, but that's pretty much it. I don't even think I read the blurb in the back before I just started reading the book. It's kind of a small one, so it was an easy read. And I'm kind of glad I did it that way because I feel like the book has such a big reputation that it's unavoidable to kind of know stuff about it. But if I had done all of that research, the effect of the book itself probably would have been lost on me, which is the fact that from the very beginning of the book, you pretty much know exactly what's going to happen, even when you don't know anything else about it. And that's an effect that Baldwin like chooses to have on you. So I actually read this quote somewhere about the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, and I think the beginning of the Broadway show Hadestown also starts with a song that's similar to this, which says that we all know how the story ends, but we still listen to it anyway, right? Like, even though we know the end, like, why do we keep coming back to these stories? And it's the idea that in a tragedy, like in a Shakespeare play or something like that, you always know what's gonna happen, and yet the characters are stuck playing out those roles, and you can't pull them out of the story, you can't change what's gonna happen. They're stuck, you're stuck, everyone's stuck in this vehicle, and that's what makes it a tragedy. And that effect, really, you can feel throughout this book. Not only does it starts with David, the main character. This video is going to have spoilers, but honestly, like I said, the structure of the story is not one of suspense. Like, you know what's going to happen from the get-go. But David is kind of reminiscing. So he's on this very fateful night. He knows something horrible is going to happen to Giovanni the next day. We know that within the first few pages. And he's thinking back on his relationship with Giovanni, what brought Giovanni here, but also him, like David himself, to this point in their relationship. So it's all in retrospect, so everything has already happened, and yet the sense of doom is lingering because the next day we find out is when Giovanni is going to be executed, right? But we need to find out why and everything. So it starts out that way, but even throughout the story there are, like, you know, when he's telling us the actual story of how they fall in love and their relationship together, it's so seductive to get into this idea of maybe things will turn out okay, like maybe I misunderstood things a little bit. And James Baldwin never lets you do that because he like flashes forward sometimes and he's like, oh, we used to take these walks along the river and we used to pass the firemen like all the time, and then it was the firemen who recognized Giovanni and got him caught later on, right? And like, even in that happiest moment, he like snaps you forward into the future or into the past from David's point of view and says, no, like, don't be happy because we know what's gonna happen here. So there's that sense of doom like lingering over the whole story, which is what makes it a tragedy, and I think works so well in this story. There's actually this quote in the introduction. It says, like, before discussing this book further, there are spoilers, so you might not want to read the introduction till you're done with the book, which is kind of a funny thing to say in an introduction. But that's kind of what I'm talking about. But there's this critic who's quoted, Nelson Algren of The Nation, and he said, "This novel is more than any other report on homosexuality. It is a story of a man who could not make up his mind, one who could not say yes to life. It is a glimpse into the special hell of Gannett, told with the driving intensity and horror sustained all the way." And I think really, like, the critic like hits it on the nail. That's exactly what it is. And you know, towards the end of the book, I know I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to talk about the structural aspect before getting into some of the specifics. Towards the end of the book, so the structure, there's, I would say, 5 major characters in this book. There's David, who's our protagonist. He's this man from America who's living in Paris. He's homosexual, I think. I don't even think he's bi. I think he's just gay, but he's very much repressed it. He's very ashamed of it. He's the narrator of the story. It's told in his perspective. And he's living in Paris, and he has this friend named Jacques, who's this older man who's like richer and all of that stuff. Jacques and Guillermo, I think, is the other man. I'm going to be mispronouncing some of these names. But both of them are like older gay men, and David is friends with both of them. Guillermo, I think, owns a bar. He owns a bar, and Jacques is like his friend, and he takes David around and stuff like that. The role of these 2 older men is so important, and I'm going to come back to that. But basically, Jacques is David's friend. Both of them go together to the bar that Guillermo owns, and Giovanni is working there. He's this young guy from Italy who's come and settled down in Paris. And of course, like, as you can tell from the title of the book, Giovanni and David fall in love. And that's kind of the driving force of the story. But from the get-go, like from the first page, and also like while he's meeting Giovanni at the bar and stuff, David is engaged to this girl called Hella, who has run away to Spain to like think over his proposal, because he proposed to her and this thing. We also learn a little bit about David's dad, who's back in America, but I wouldn't say he's one of the main characters. But okay, coming back to the structure of this story and why the storytelling itself tells you it's a tragedy before any of the plot points come into play, right? The sense of inevitability that hangs over the whole thing. I want to pick 2 quotes to tell you guys about this. So towards the very end, like just like a few pages towards the end, Hella and David are having this fight. Basically, she knows that he's gay at this point. Giovanni is going to be executed soon. She's leaving him. They're having a fight. So then David says to her, "I wish anyway," I said at last, "that you'd believe me when I said that. If I was lying, I wasn't lying to you." She turned towards me with a terrible face. "I was the one you were talking to. I was the one you wanted to come with you to this terrible house in the middle of nowhere. I was the one you said you wanted to marry." "I mean," I said, "I was lying to myself." "Oh," said Hella, "I see. That makes everything different, of course." "I only mean to say," I shouted, "that whatever I've done to hurt you, I didn't mean to do." "Don't shout," said Hella. "I'll soon be gone. Then you can shout it to those hills out there. Shout it to the peasants. How guilty you are. How you love to be guilty." And I've just like started the entire book, to be honest. But I just think that that's such a crux of the book. Like, it would have been so easy to make Hella this stock character and not really make her important at all. But not a single person is wasted in this book, because she is such an important foil. She herself brings so much to this book, even though she comes in very late in the story. Like, her presence looms over the whole thing. This threat of like, Hella's coming back. Like, when Hella comes back, things will go back to normal for David. He's gonna ditch Giovanni. Like, even when they're in the happiest moments, he's always like, oh, this is not real life. Like, even when he's so happy, even when he's so in love, he's like, Hella will come back. I will leave Giovanni for her. Like, he's thinking those thoughts as he lovingly looks at Giovanni as well, which just shows you how much he's deceiving himself, how afraid he is of his own sexuality, and by extension of that, how afraid he is of his own happiness and letting himself have that. And this statement by Hella is just so damning towards the end. You know, it's like, what is the point of all of your guilt and your like inability to be happy and like punishing yourself all the time? You know, like, oh, you didn't do it to me, like, congratulations, like, I still got hurt along the way, right? Like, they're like engaged and living in the countryside at this point. I think that was so well done, and I think it ties so beautifully to the dedication that is at the beginning. So sorry, the dedication is actually to someone, but there's a quote at the very beginning of the book. Can you see it? Like out of focus. It's a Walt Whitman quote, and it says, "I am the man. I suffered. I was there. And I think it just like is such a beautiful structure in that you start with this Walt Whitman quote, right? And then you end with this damning statement from Hella towards the end. And you're like, that's the point of this book. David was the man and he was there and he suffered. And honestly, a lot of it is his fault. And like Hella said, it's like, what was the point of all of this? Like, you didn't do it to hurt me, but you hurt me anyway, and you hurt yourself, and nobody's happy at the end of this. But I think that's the tragedy of it all. You know, like, that's what I'm trying to say, and that's why it's such a beautifully crafted story, and it like hits you so much because there's no escape. And I think that feeling of no escape is what a tragedy is all about. So that is one of the quotes. And then quickly to wrap up this point, there is, okay, so there's a really famous quote from this book that everyone always talks about. I actually thought Ocean Vuong wrote this, but I guess it's James Baldwin. And it says, "One day I'll weep for this. One of these days I'll really start to cry." So this is something that David like thinks to himself, right? And I actually like, this is why I can never lend my books to people, because I always like write all over them. But I connected it to this other quote that comes like one page earlier. And it's something that Giovanni says. And he says, "The Americans have no sense of doom, none whatsoever. They do not recognize doom when they see it." And I mean, this is like at the 137th page, so it's like 20-ish pages before the end of the book. So we already know what's going to happen. But I think that just kind of foreshadows, but also foretells like exactly what's going to happen. That David is in this situation that is so sad and so suffocating from the get-go, just because he can't make up his mind, he can't accept himself and who he is. And also, I guess, like, the world that he lives in doesn't allow him to do those things. Like, you can't really blame him, he's not living in a bubble. But just like all of those themes together, I think, are so beautiful. I think that is the thing that I loved so much about this book from a structural point of view in terms of what it achieved, because I don't think I have noticed that as much in any other work as I did in this one. But apart from that, honestly, it's just such a beautiful book. Like, the language, the conversations, just so well done. The struggle, of course, is David's. Like, he's not able to accept that he's a homosexual man, and there's a lot of different things that come up for him. But I think the angle that this book brought up for me that I've never really considered before is, so like I said, there's these two older gay men who are characters in the book as well, Jacques and Guilherme. I feel like I'm messing up this man's name more every time I say it. We'll call him G. He's the one who owns the bar, and he's this old name in France and things like that. And they're older gay men. And David talks about them in such a, I don't want to say like derogatory, but like he just feels so much disgust towards them. But at the same time, like some kind of affinity that he's disgusted by the affinity he feels towards them. And I think he feels a lot of fear of becoming them at some point, because they're obviously like older men. He like does describe their bodies at certain points, and he's like, oh, it's like dough, it's like curdled milk and all of that stuff, which, like, fair enough, you know, like they're older. But I think it also comes from like a spiritual place where he sees these older gay men as kind of predators going after, or like aggressively flirting with and going after younger gay men, basically, and using Jacques' money and Guillermo's money as well, I guess, and power and position as the bar owner, using these things to basically get boyfriends, which I think is actually a very familiar trope if we think about it. Like, even when I was thinking about Modern Family, like I was thinking of Pepper, like the friend of Mitch and Cam, and how he has this like young hot boyfriend and stuff. And I think that's just kind of a trope that we see in popular culture all the time, especially about gay men. But he sees it with so much disgust, because he's like, they're obviously not attracted to these men, the younger gay men. They're just doing it to get access to like money or power or whatever it is that they need, and they're so desperate in that situation, and these men are like taking advantage of that desperation. but also these older men are so desperate because like they don't have any other avenue of fulfilling their need. And there's actually this conversation that happens between David and Jacques at a certain point. Like I think it's at the precipice of Giovanni and David like really being in a relationship together, and Jacques is like, you can make this something that's just physical, and then you still hold back a part of yourself and it'll all turn to ashes in your mouth, or you can really allow it to be a real connection and it'll be the most beautiful thing in the world to you. And if you don't let yourself do that, then everything, like it'll always be darkness even when you're trying to touch the light or something like that, he says. And it's just such a great conversation because it's so clearly about Jacques' own experiences and his own regrets that have led him to now become this older man. Like even when we meet David and Jacques like the first time, it's all about like David trying to get money from this man. And oh my god, there's this one quote that honestly I love all of their conversations with each other. Oh yeah, so David is saying this: I knew something else, that Jacques wanted affection for me was involved with desire. The desire, in fact, to be rid of me, to be able, soon, to despise me as he now despised that army of boys who had come, without love, to his bed. I held my own against this desire by pretending that Jacques and I were friends, by forcing Jacques, on pain of humiliation, to pretend this. I pretended not to see, although I exploited it, the lust not quite sleeping in his bright, bitter eyes. And by rough male candor, which I conveyed to him as his, with which I conveyed to him his case was hopeless, I compelled him endlessly to hope. And just like this game that he's playing, like knowing that this older man kind of desires him, but not like really desires him, just has like this kind of acquisitionary like impulse because he knows he can't get the real thing. And then how he toys with that, but then at the same time he needs it to like get this financial favor and stuff. And then that being the person who tells him like, you can keep going down this path of hiding from who you are, and then everything will turn to ashes in your mouth, like any bit of connection that you get. I think it's just so beautifully constructed. And even in the end, like what happens with Giovanni, this is of course like a major spoiler, but he kills G. He kills G, who owns the bar. And he does it because we don't know the exact details of it, because by then David is no longer in Giovanni's life, but he's like imagining the sequence of events. And he's like, oh, like Giovanni is really poor towards the end and he probably got desperate. And, you know, he finally gave in to the advances from G. And then G probably like used that. And then after they had sex or whatever, he probably denied giving Giovanni his job back. And that's probably when Giovanni killed him, because he just got so frustrated at having been used this way. And, you know, like having done this to himself in a way, but also this being done to him by someone else, like just all of those emotions together. And I think, like we talked about the sense of tragedy, I talked about the sense of tragedy, right? And having these two older men, also choosing for it to be two older men rather than it being one older man that he can kind of focus all of his stuff on. But he talks about all the gay men like in the bar like pretty often through the story. He sees them with so much repulsion. He doesn't want to turn out like them. But at the same time, the way that he's repressing his feelings, the way that he won't allow himself real connection, you see that is a real fear that he could end up exactly like that. Like chasing something, but not ever the real thing, just like a substitute for it. And having these two older men be both tragic and villainous figures kind of in the book, I think also sets up this dichotomy within the gay community of who are your role models, right? Like, if you look down at the people who are like older than you within the community because you don't see their lives as meaningful, fruitful, happy, dignified, then you can't, then you're, that fear of accepting yourself, there's obviously so many aspects to it, social, political, etc. But also that fear of like turning into that person if you do accept yourself, that I don't think I've read in any, I don't think I've realized it in any other book, which this book made me realize and just made me so sad. Like there's this scene where David is in the post office and he sees this sailor walking towards him, and he's like the super masculine sailor, and David is like watching him, and he's so jealous almost in a way, and at the same time he's like desiring this man. And then the man looks at him, and you can see like David seeing himself from the sailor's eyes, and he says this line. It's like basically he thinks that the sailor recognizes right away what David was thinking, the fact that he was like lusting after him or what, or like envying him, and all of these mixture of emotions. And he says, and I wondered what he had seen in me to elicit such an instantaneous contempt. I was too old to suppose that it had anything to do with my walk or the way I held my hands or my voice, which, anyway, he had not yet heard. It was something else, and I would never see it. I would never dare to see it. It would be like looking at the naked sun. And he's obviously talking about himself, right? Like the truth of himself. And to acknowledge that he's never going to see that part of himself, or like allow himself to see it, that it's too painful for him to see it, I think is just, it's so sad, and it's so beautiful. And I think it like really strikes, I'm not a gay man, but I think it really strikes at the heart of like the whole tragedy of what he's going through, and in just such a succinct way, in such an instantaneous way. Because I think this idea of masculinity, so he describes these older gay men, other gay men in the bar and stuff, as fairies all the time, and he kind of hates that. He hates that they come off like kind of effeminate. And actually there's a point where after David and Giovanni break up and all of that stuff, Giovanni starts going around with Jacques, mostly because he needs money and things like that. And Giovanni starts affecting a few like effeminate gestures, and David is like, oh, he's making me take part in his humiliation. And he really sees those effeminate gestures as humiliating to Giovanni, as him giving up his masculinity because he's with Jacques, and he's kind of like fallen into this trap that David sees from the get-go as this cycle, right? A cycle that humiliates both the older man and the younger gay man. And I just thought it was so interesting, right? Like there's so many parallels, that there's so much that we can talk about here. We can talk about the sugar baby older man dynamic that exists in heterosexual relationships as well. Like there's a lot of young women who say it's empowering to be in those relationships because beauty and desire are forms of or are routes to power. They are some kind of capital that you have, and you can convert that in a capitalistic world to money and favors and luxury and all of that stuff. But then at the same time, I think it's impossible for anyone to say they're not being exploited for those things specifically, and that beauty and desire aren't actually the best forms of capital to have. There's this whole essay about it, but I won't get into that. But then at the same time, there's this dynamic of the older men being exploited. You know, like the young women have this sense of like contempt and disgust towards the older men, and they're like, oh, I'm taking advantage of him, and he doesn't even know. I'm getting like these bags and these favors and stuff like that. But then the whole world kind of sees the dynamic the other way around, where they're like, oh, this old man is the one who's taking advantage of you, and you're giving up something that you shouldn't be giving up, which is obviously a very like, it's like a very sexist undertone that comes with it. But I do think there's a lot of feminist reading about this that says, keep that aside, keep the idea of a woman's honor being tied to her sexuality and like having sex with men aside, but thinking this is the capital that you can exploit still puts you in danger, and like these are the ways that it does and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that we can discuss in that dynamic and how it plays out in this book as well, like the relationship between desire, money, power, all of those things, and who's exploiting who basically, or like everyone's just being exploited by everyone, so who is making the system run? And it seems like shame is the primary thing that's making the system run, and poverty, like spiritual and material poverty. But there's also other things to be said, I think, apart from like relationships of like sugar babies and old men, even just like within like younger gay men and older gay men, like it is obviously a sexual relationship that Giovanni and Jax are having, that's what's implied, but I think in a way, like, David's relationship to this whole thing is also one of identity, of like, oh, this is who I'm going to grow up into being, which I think is missing in a heterosexual sugar baby older man relationship, of being like, oh, someday I will be this older man who's powerful but undesirable, and I will not have real connection, and I will have to seek it out in this exploitative way. And that fear, I think, is like also something that is really driving this book, which, like, there's so much to think about there, right? Like, yeah, there's just so much that you can talk about with this book. So I'm gonna go a little bit quicker because I think I'm at like the 30-minute mark. Something I wrote about this book is that it's really about desire and disgust, and how close both of those emotions are for David. And it's about people who awaken us to ourselves and how painful that can be. There's a conversation, I think in the same one, where Jacques and David are talking about the Garden of Eden, and they're talking about how people can't stay in the Garden of Eden. Like, as soon as they're there, they want to leave. And basically the question of the Garden of Eden is not one of staying or leaving. It's about people who remember it and people who forget. And remembering or forgetting can make you a hero, but there's very few of those people. It's mostly cowards who forget and cowards who remember, and they both deal with it in different ways. And I think it's very, like, obvious to me that Giovanni's room is in a way that Eden to David, that is where he found love and connection and all of these things, even when he's constantly undermining it and trying to leave and treating Giovanni badly, and Giovanni treats him badly. Like, both of them do things to each other. It was just too much for him to bear, to like be in that room. And there's this quote later on that's like, we have a home, but it disappears as soon as we go back. So we only have a home as long as we don't go back to it. And I think in a way that's what Giovanni's room is to David as well. There's also this idea of how the end of innocence, like leaving the Garden of Eden as the end of innocence, right, is also the end of guilt. And I think that ties back into this whole idea of this tragedy of it couldn't have been any other way. Like, there is no guilt, there is no innocence in this story. Like, it was all preordained. It was always going to end in this extremely sad, tragic way. You're just falling from the get-go. Like, there's nothing else that you could have really done. It's this sense of like a noose tightening throughout the story, I think. What else? I think what was also interesting is that in the midst of all of this, right, like the entire structure is like so intricate. There's so many ideas there, but at the base of the structure, the foundation of the book is Giovanni's room. It is Giovanni and David and the love that they have for each other. And how do you write a book where that love is constantly falling apart, there is no hope for it, and all of the characters are extremely flawed, and there are all these material conditions that are driving them apart, poverty being the most specific one, but obviously like also this the stigma of homosexuality. Like, that seems almost like too on the nose to say, but obviously like that is the atmosphere of the book. But you still feel like they're in love because of the conversations that they have, even when they're fighting, even when they're lying to each other. And in fact, the fact that David is constantly lying to Giovanni, and Giovanni knows that he's being lied to, and he like doesn't forgive it, but I don't know what he does with it, but he just kind of knows it and doesn't do anything about it. And then the other way around as well, like because it's from David's point of view, we see him like noticing that like Giovanni is lying to him, and he allows Giovanni to be dishonest to him, and it doesn't really mean anything, doesn't really lead to any action, because in some way they're honest with each other on a level that's beyond whatever conversation they're currently having. And that's what makes you realize that they're really in love, and that this really was something that they will never find with anyone else ever again. And that's what makes it so sad that like they can't have it, that David won't allow them to have it, you know, like he won't allow himself to have it, and he won't allow Giovanni to have it. In fact, there's a point where they're finally saying goodbye to each other, like Hella's back in town, all of that stuff, and Giovanni is like, if I could like tie you up, if I could beat you up, and if I could just make you stay here, I would. But I can't. Like, even if I did all those things, I can't make you stay. And you realize, like, there's this undertone of violence throughout that scene, but I think it's just like this helplessness also of like, Giovanni knows the truth of what's happening. He feels enough ownership of David because of their love and because of what they've shared to be like, I know that this is a real thing. Like, you can't take that away from it. I know it's a real thing. And like, why should I lose this thing just because you are too much of a coward to like have it? But at the same time, like, if you don't stay here willingly, there is nothing that I can do to stop you. Like, even if I physically restrain you, like, you won't actually be here. And it's just it's so heart-wrenching. And I think it like is that lesson that like, you can go to the bridge and you can be ready, and it can be the right love, it can be the right person, it can be everything can be right, but if the other person doesn't join you on the bridge, there is nothing that you can do. Which is just so sad. It's just so good. Honestly, I have so many pages like folded up that I want to read quotes from, because it's such a beautiful book. The quote that I was talking about earlier is, all touch but no contact and no light. Jacques says that to David. But I'm not going to be able to do it justice. I'm also almost out of time, so I'm going to stop talking about this book. But definitely read it. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I actually ordered like 3 other books by James Baldwin immediately after finishing this, and I'm so excited to read them. I know that I talked a lot about structure. I talked a lot about the ideas in this book, but a book is not made of just those things, right? It's made of like one word after the other, like sentences, paragraphs, all of that stuff. And a lot of authors sometimes like exist really well on the ideas plane, structural plane, but the actual joy of reading the words themselves is maybe not that great. But in James Baldwin, like, it's so good. Like, his words, his sentences, his ideas, his conversations, just like the imagery that he uses is so beautiful that it almost like distracts you from like the structural genius of the book and the ideas and the themes that he's exploring. Like, it's like neck and neck. So you're like immersed in this beautiful sensory experience of reading the book, and at the same time you're like, just your mind is like being blown because it's such an amazing book. But yeah, definitely read it. I enjoyed it so much. I'm so grateful that I read this book, and I will be back soon with more book updates. Before I wrap up this hella long video, I do want to say that my book's final-ish draft, I'm still making a few changes, but the final-ish draft is done. I actually finished it in time for my birthday in August, and I printed out a few copies. I started making these videos mostly to update people on my writing journey, and then it became completely about reading. But honestly, the reading informs my writing and the other way around as well. So I just want to share this really happy news because I'm really happy with it, and it just feels really surreal to hold it in my hand, even though I printed it and I paid for it, so like it shouldn't feel surreal at all. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will be back with more videos. Hello. I know it's like that video was so long, so what could I possibly have to say that I like didn't cover there? But I had 3 more things that I wanted to say, so I'm going to say them quickly. Also, it's already a long video, so like, who am I kidding? It doesn't matter if it's longer. The first part is that I kind of mentioned the spiritual and material poverty that is in this book and how it informs the power and desire and the relationships within it. So actually, I thought this book would pair really well with someone watching The Materialist, and like there was a lot to discuss there. I actually posted about this on Instagram, and then Celine Song's Instagram reposted it. It is definitely not her and her team just reposting everything she's tagged in, but how cool is that? I felt like I was like trying to commune with a god or something. I was like, Celine Song, is that you? Like, tell me if I'm right about The Materialist. So that was the first thing. That was kind of cool. The second thing is that there's this amazing, so this book is a little bit about Americans as well, because David is American, and there's this amazing line where he's like, all the American men smell like soap, and I was like, they what? And it's like, they smell like soap. And it's such a good line, and it comes back in such a good way towards the end of the book. And if anyone's read this and they want to discuss that, like, I will talk to you for hours, which is a threat, but I will talk to you for hours about that, because I just thought that was such a good line and such a good idea, and it's like throughout the book, and it comes back in such a good way. And then the third thing, what was the third thing? Okay, I guess you guys are in luck, because I actually can't remember what the third thing was that I forgot to mention about this book. Okay, let me quickly... Okay, I can't remember what the third thing is, but those are the two things that I missed out on, and goodbye, actually, this time.